Birth of Christianity. Jesus of Nazareth. That, of course, is the figure. We will look at it more from historical point of view, because it's obviously not a class on Christianity. It is a class on philosophy, and look at it from more or less neutral point of view. What do we know? We know that Jesus of Nazareth was born, funny enough, 4 years before the birth of Christ, and died somewhere around 33. Why is it 4 years before Jesus born before the birth of Jesus? Because actually the way they calculated it at first, the year 1 was wrong. And they did it around 6th century or something. And at the time they didn't have very good methods, so they kind of just converted whatever calendar they had into this calendar from the birth of Christ, and they did it incorrectly. So we now think historically that Jesus was actually born a little bit earlier than they thought, and so they're counting years from the wrong year. But it's not exact science, so there could be plus minus a couple of years. However, most scholars think he was born around 4 years before Christ, so 4 BC. And somewhere around 33, he was in fact executed on the cross. The main source of information are 4 so-called canonical Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They are written by anonymous authors. There's actually quite a bit of disagreement to who exactly is an author of which one of them. Who are these people? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are some ideas about it, but we don't know for sure. There's also a lot of disagreement about which one of them was written first, how they related to each other. There are different theories about that. Like some people think Mark was first, and the other ones simply repeat Mark with some variations. There's also versions that another one was first, and so on. It's very hard to establish now because we are 2,000 years after the fact, and there's not that many sources which can definitively tell us how exactly they were written. Also, there are other Gospels which are not included in the New Testament. At one point, the church fathers met up and decided which ones they take, which ones they don't take. So actually, if you really research these, you'll see there are several other ones which are variations of the story, not included in canonical one, but for historians they're still of interest. Because obviously when they decided which ones to include, which ones are not, it was a little bit non-scientific, right? They got their own reasons why they decided to include certain ones. But this is the best source of information. How reliable is this source? Well, since we don't even know exactly who wrote it, it's hard to be sure, but given that there is some other information we have, what can we overall say for a fact? The general consensus is Jesus was indeed contemporary of John the Baptist and was indeed crucified by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was appointed to Judea. Judea is what now is Israel. At the time they called it Judea, and it was a colony of Rome. So Pontius Pilate was Roman appointee as a governor of this particular Roman colony. They also had their own Jewish authorities, because the Jews lived there, right? And Jewish authorities apparently were the ones demanding that Jesus be crucified, while Pontius Pilate famously washed his hands. He said, well, if you want to do that, be my guest. And that happened somewhere when he was in office, between 26 and 36, probably around 30, 33. That's the years when that happened. After Jesus' death, his followers, he had followers for sure, said he arose from the dead. And although exact details of their experiences are not very clear, because we don't think any of them actually wrote the Gospels, right? Who wrote the Gospels? Well, for one thing, all the Gospels are written in Greek. They were speaking Aramaic. Why did they write it in Greek? Because the Greek was considered a language of educated people. So whoever wrote it were well-educated people, and it happened sometime after the fact. Again, hard to say how many years. So if Jesus was crucified somewhere around 30, 33, the most likely that the first written gospel was written maybe 20 years later or something. So how well did they know these events? Who knows? They may have not witnessed it themselves. They may have collected stories from other people. So it's very hard now to determine exactly what did happen there. Obviously, for people who are religious, this is canonical, so they don't question it, right? But from historical point of view, we have to have some other testimony, not just what we have in these Gospels, and we don't really have much. There are some mentionings of Jesus, so we know for a fact, like I said, that he did in fact live around this time, was crucified around this time, had some followers. That's pretty much all we can say. Now, after that, as you probably know, Christianity did actually slowly gain more and more followers. Not immediately. Also, it was very dangerous to become Christian at the time because Christians were persecuted by the Roman authorities. Roman authorities specifically didn't like the fact that they considered Jesus to be the king of earth instead of the emperor. They thought the emperor should be considered the king of earth, and they didn't know exactly who Jesus was, but they didn't like the idea of people worshiping somebody else, even a dead person, right? So what are the differences between Greek and Judeo-Christian tradition? First of all, remember, for Greeks, they were polytheists. They thought there were many gods. Judeo-Christian tradition, one God, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing. The gods of Greeks were subject to fate. They were limited. This one is supreme. Greeks thought that they were immanent, so they basically are part of this world. They don't necessarily live among us, but they live on a Mount Olympus, so right, there's a place where they hang around and so on. Now the Judeo-Christian God is of course transcendent, so he is not part of the world. He is external to the world. So if you imagine the world being like, this is the world, the entire universe, God is somewhere outside of that. That's what transcendent means. And of course, Greek gods are more or less impersonal, whereas Judeo-Christian God is personal. Takes care of people, wants them to succeed in life, so to say, and become better people, and so on. For the Greeks, we are searching for truth. We're trying to figure out what the truth is. Judeo-Christian tradition truth, Jesus is searching for us. So we actually should follow the truth and not necessarily seek it ourselves because it's already there. And finally, for the Greeks, logos, remember the logos, permeates the universe. The universe has this logos everywhere. The Judeo-Christian tradition, Mark actually mentions logos. First there was word, he uses the word logos, but for the Christians, logos was God himself, Jesus. Jesus is the word, Jesus is logos. Okay, now what was happening with those first Christians at the time? First of all, they believed that Jesus is supposed to be resurrected very, very shortly. In fact, most of them thought he'll be resurrected and judge them while they are still alive. So that is slowly became less and less possible because hundreds of years were passing and nothing was happening. So by now, we of course don't expect it anytime soon, but they really thought it was going to happen very, very shortly. Second thing, they were persecuted for a few hundred years. They were persecuted all the way until first Roman emperor became Christian. So Christianity was gaining more and more ground. Eventually, Constantine, the Roman emperor, was Christian and became Christian emperor. That was in 305. So like 270 years after this. Clearly, for these 270 years, Christians didn't have it very good. They were persecuted because, again, they thought that Christ is the emperor, but the Roman authorities didn't like it, so they were burning them at the crosses, burning them at the stake, torturing them, There were plenty of Christian martyrs, so-called people who believed in Christ and died because of that. That is some historical fact. They also saw it as their duty to evangelize the world, to spread the word of Jesus, to make sure everybody actually is on their side. And they were fairly successful. It was very successful in terms of like more and more people indeed joining Christianity. Plus, and we'll talk about it a little bit more, and that's actually where philosophy comes in, they had to fight so-called heresies. What exactly are heresies? So the word heresy just means a choice. So in this case, different choices of how to interpret the story were considered different heresies. One of the problems which Greeks didn't have, but Christians did, is the problem of so-called faith and reason. How do you square it? Greeks kind of considered reason to be the only way to the truth. They were not really worried about gods. Remember, for them, gods were kind of like there on Olympus, fine, we don't need to worry about that, let's just use our reason for everything. The traditions of the poets they were rejecting, and that didn't have much of a consequence for them. For Jewish people, and Jewish people believed in God way before Christ, right? The Old Testament, that's like several thousand years prior to that. But for them also there was no problem because they never even tried to apply reason to any of it, just faith. You believe, that's it. Now for Christians, many of this became problematic. They tried to combine reason with faith. Why was it the case? Well, many people who lived in this area were actually Greek or Romans who had close connection to these Greek philosophical schools and so on. So for them it was difficult to just accept something on faith without questioning. They were questioning it. And the questions came up like this: is Christian belief rational? Can you really believe in it? There are several problems, we'll talk about them later, if you look at it from a purely rational point of view, which immediately emerge. What is the relationship between faith and reason? Like, should you first believe and then reason will help? Or should you use your reason to find which way to believe? Can one coherently embrace both roads to the truth? Can you at the same time use your reason and also believe? Or do you have to pick one? If faith and reason lead to conflicting conclusions, how do we resolve the quarrel? Let's say you believe in something, but your reason tells you that could not be the truth. For example, well, what's the one thing immediately kind of jumps out at you as a contradiction between reason and faith in Christianity? What do you think? Like, just from what you know about the story, does anything seem a little bit strange? The story of Jesus, right? So, you know, what happened to Jesus?
He got crucified.
Exactly. So anything strange about his story?
Him coming back to life.
Exactly. I mean, doesn't it seem a little bit unreasonable? How many people have you seen come back to life after they were dead? Probably not. He came back to life. So clearly something here is not right. You can believe it, of course, but if you're using your reason, you have a problem. So how do you approach that? Things like this. There are several others, but that's the very first one which immediately comes up. And then, should a person of faith dabble in the speculations of pagan philosophers in the first instance? Should we, what do we do about Plato, Aristotle, all this stuff we studied before? Should we just leave it aside? Should we somehow adapt it? And there were both approaches, actually. Some of the early Christians said, all this gibberish we don't care about. The Bible says some things, that's all we need. Others, also Christian people, said, no, including St. Augustine, who we'll talk about today. He said, that actually has a lot of good stuff in it, and we can combine them. We can understand Bible better if we also use Plato, for example. So that is some of the things which they were dealing with. And like I said, there were many of these heresies, many different versions, because at the beginning they couldn't agree on what exactly is the story, which Gospels tell us the truth, how does the whole thing work. One of the philosophical issues was how to express the rather poetic theology of the Hebraic tradition in terms of what would be clear and acceptable to the Greek minds. So in the Bible, it's allegories, right? Greeks, they were using reason. They were using these clear arguments. How do you combine that? The culture presented a spectrum of religious philosophies, each vying for influence over the church. And the word heresy, like I said, just meant choice. Which ones do you choose? Do you choose this specific variety of Christianity or the other one? And all of them were considered Christians at the time. They didn't have a clear one. Orthodoxy, which comes from Greek orthos, doxos, right belief, came up later. At the beginning, some of the most important ones, Gnosticism, Manichaeism. They were varieties of early Christian beliefs. They were very popular. There's not much difference between them, really. Manichaeism we're going to talk about because St. Augustine was Manichaean at first. And one more thing which we need to talk about a little bit, Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism basically based on Plato. But Plato's teachings themselves by this time were interpreted in a somewhat of a different way. People who did this, and it was quite popular during the 3rd century, they thought themselves as followers of Plato. They didn't think they were Neoplatonists. This is what we call it today, Neoplatonism. But from our point of view, if you read Plato, and if you look at their views, they already are changing Plato a little bit. They're making Plato into something else. And that is pretty much inevitable. You can think about it also in this way, like Marxism, right? If you read Marx, the way he wrote in the 19th century, you will find certain point of view. But if you look at Marxists today, the way they interpret Marx, they actually have a different interpretation. Similar thing happened back then, because with time people look at things differently, and when they look at things differently, even the same works can be interpreted in a different way. So what was happening at the time is the Roman Empire was beginning to crumble. It was beginning to crumble. People were longing for salvation, absorption into God, and that gave rise to Plato's ideas. Because remember, Plato, hopefully you guys now know him, he is very kind of spiritual, talks about the soul. Actually, he was talking about life after death, which is probably even more important than this life, and how material things are evil because they pull us away from ideas to world of forms. And so all this stuff was kind of quite popular along with Christianity, and it started merging with Christianity around the same time. So Neoplatonism, among the leading figures was Plotinus. Plotinus lived 205 to 270, and then his disciple Porphyry, who actually summarized his work in what is known as Enneads. And then there were a couple of others, Plutarch and Proclus at Athens. So what exactly did they believe? They took it from some of the Plato's works. In particular, there's some stuff in Republic, which we mentioned a little bit. The one, right? The one is the good. The good is at the top of this whole, you may call it a pyramid, right? It's like a pyramid. You can think about it as a pyramid too. So the good. Remember, that's the form of the good outside of this cave, the sun. Then underneath the good, they thought there were Platonic forms. The form of redness, the form of beauty, all these other forms, which are again very pure. But then they thought that below that would be a soul. And there is difference of the world soul and the human soul. They are related, but it's not the same one. So the world soul, then different organisms. not necessarily human, but all sorts of organisms, live creatures, animals, and so on. Then bodies. And finally, matter. Remember, matter is the lowest one. This is the source of all evil, bad things, and it's at the bottom of everything else, furthest from the good. So you may put evil here. The further from the good, the more evil. The closer to the good, the more good. So based on Plato, but not exactly, some of the things Plato didn't really think about it in this way. So again, at the top of everything, the good, the highest being, the highest unity. In fact, it is so unified that you can't even think about it. Because as soon as you start thinking about it, you're making a separation. There is, let's say an object, whatever it is, and there is your thought about the object. And you see that's a separation. You're already separating the thing from the thought. So the good at the top is an absolute unity. It is so unified that you cannot understand it at all. Transcendent, incomprehensible, not engaged in any activity, just like Aristotle also thought that thinking and thinking kind of thing. All things emanate from it, like this Plato's sun. Remember that if this is the sun, the light of the sun reaches everything, but less and less. So there is more light here, there is less light here, and of course at the very bottom there is complete darkness. Intellect, on the other hand, is just slightly below that. This is where the forms are. The intellect is divine mind, you may say. And that's already a little bit below this, the good. It is eternal, free of imperfection, and intellect has all these forms. So you may think of the forms as a content of the divine mind. And then the soul. That's the third reality. Emanating from intellect, it's a mediator between the spiritual realm of the forms and the good and the actual world of the senses. Makes cosmos one living organism. The entire cosmos is like an animal. And it has two aspects. The higher part, that's the one which looks to intellect untouched by what is beneath. So higher part is connected to the forms, to the pure intellect. And the lower part, and that is the one which actually connects to the sensible world, replicates the forms within the world. World soul, individual human souls are aspects of this world soul. Our souls are like the light from the sun which shines into each individual house. Some have maybe a little more, some have a little less. So human soul replicates the structure of the world soul. Intellect is higher, body is lower. We all have intellect, we all have body. Our intellect is connected to these higher forms. The body is what pulls us down. The bodily pleasures are something which we should get rid of ideally. The soul survives the death of the body and reincarnated, but does not retain its memories. It doesn't remember what happened in previous life, but it is eternal. And the matter, of course, is a source of all evil. That is the most unfortunate part of the world, but necessary. Remember, Demiurge, when he was creating the world, had to have some matter, and matter is what brings this chance and other unpleasantness into this world. So physical should still share at least some of the goodness, because you cannot have things completely evil. But the more matter you have, the less of the goodness there is. Degrees of being, anything short of God still necessarily falls short of perfect goodness. Otherwise, no world would be possible, right? Because if God took his perfect goodness and just replicated it on every single level, then that would be just God. But in order for him to create the world, he had to go a little bit with other levels. And this is going to be important, especially for St. Augustine, so we need to kind of keep that in mind. The cosmos is like a beautiful painting or well-written play. Each part has a role to play. Okay, so Neoplatonism was attractive to many Christians. You hopefully can see why. There are certain things there which they didn't like, but overall it did seem like something they can adopt, and they did adopt it. Became very important to shape the Christianity, especially towards Middle Ages. Some of the well-known figures who combined it were Origen. We're not going to talk about Origen, but there's actually some information in the book. St. Augustine, who we'll talk about today, and then another person who we will not talk about, but very influential, was Boethius. This is considered like some of the church fathers. The writings, especially of St. Augustine and Boethius, considered to be like fundamental to the Christian religion today. So now let's talk about Augustine. That was the reading too from Augustine. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Interesting figure. Who was St. Augustine? He was actually born in Africa, in the northern part of Africa. His mother was Christian. His father was not. So you can already see the Christianity, because there's like different influence. Some people were already Christian, some people were not. He was born in 354. So 354, that's already AD, so this is our time. And we can stop counting it backwards. It's about 330 years after, 320 years after Christ was crucified. Christianity by then was already official religion in Rome, but it was still, not everybody was Christian. So still there were people who were pagan. And at first he himself was not Christian. He actually became Manichaean. Manichaeans had somewhat of a different explanation, and it's actually relevant to the reading, so we will talk more about it. What was happening there? To explain the evil in the world, Manichaeans went a slightly different way than Christians. They thought evil exists because there are two gods. The God which is good, the God of light, and the God which is bad, the God of darkness. And the God which is good is not all-powerful. So that was the explanation of evil. Why does evil exist if God is all-powerful? Because there's another God which is also powerful, and they are fighting. Right? So he actually liked this explanation better, at least at first. And he joined the Manichaeans. For about 9 years he was part of their sect. And then he got disillusioned. He actually met a person who was considered like the head of the Manichaean movement. He came to, I think it was actually in Italy already. He lived in Italy. He met him, and he was really disappointed. He thought, this guy is not even like, all that smart. He's actually a fraud. So because of that, he abandoned Manichaeism, but he did not become Christian right away. He actually was skeptic for a while. So he actually questioned everything. He thought, you can never know the truth. So this is skepticism, right? You just can't know anything. But eventually he was Christian. And for a while he was a professor. He was a very well-educated man. He was a professor of rhetoric in Milan, northern Italy. And that is around this time when he started reading Porphyry, that Neoplatonist philosopher, the works of Neoplatonists. And that actually impressed him quite a bit. So eventually, partly because of this, he converted to Christianity. Already 386, 387, so that's like what? He was more than 30 years old, like 32 years old. This is when he finally converted to Christianity. And then he became such a devoted Christian that he even became a bishop of Hippo. Hippo is also in northern Africa, and this is where he lived most of his life, in Hippo, until he died in 430 our time. At that point of time, barbarians were already, they sacked Rome and they were approaching this area. The Rome was slowly overtaken by the barbarians. Barbarians in this case would be what today, I guess, we mainly consider Germans. They were coming from the north, from Europe, but at the time there were more tribes, different tribes, fighting tribes with their swords and so on, and they were slowly knocking down the Roman Empire, which was collapsing because it was so big and so poorly governed at that point. This is an interesting painting, so we can imagine kind of how it will look. St. Augustine in his study. Of course, it probably is not very accurate representation because the person who painted it, Vittorio Carpaccio, lived in 1502, and that, as you can see, about 1200 years later. So clearly he was not very knowledgeable, but that is how he imagined it. And it can kind of help us a little bit too. So this is St. Augustine supposedly in his study, working, writing, books up there already. He's looking at the window and writing his work. And there's even a little nice way to kind of more clearly imagine how it all may have looked. So two of his major works, he wrote a lot. This is two major ones, Confessions and City of God. Confessions is quite fantastic. It's actually like his personal diary. He describes his entire life from the time he was born in detail. And for given that it was written in 400, so 1600 years ago, we have quite a unique document describing how people lived at the time. He describes how he grew up. He describes how he was a professor in Milan and so on. And then he describes his conversion to Christianity and a lot of other interesting things. And it is a work of philosophy. He actually is very interestingly discusses different philosophical subjects there, but it is his early work. 30 years later, he published City of God, which is his mature work, and there's a slightly different approach. In his early work, he was more optimistic about the powers of reason. What can we achieve through reason? Later on, he thought reason should actually be subordinated to faith. Faith is first, reason is second. So authority and reason. Augustine was most influenced by Plato and Neoplatonist philosophy. He himself said, this is a quote, "None of the other philosophers has come so close to us being Christians as the Platonists have. No aspect of our world can be understood apart from religious perspective. All philosophical ideas are either obstacles or vehicles in our journey of the soul to God and eternal life. God is the light. We should go towards God just like for the Platonists, right? That is what is on top of everything. But how do we get there? Knowledge, philosophy, the world, humanity, always understood in the light of their religious significance. How can they help us or how can they hinder us?" Okay, let's talk a little bit about the reading. Hopefully you guys did it, because did anybody do the reading? What did you think?
I wasn't able to read all of it, but I saw it in the beginning. They were mostly arguing about who, like the difference of evil. Someone has done evil and someone has suffered evil.
Yeah, so what's the question about evil? What are they questioning?
Isn't it God himself is evil? Kind of?
Well, the question is not so much what God is evil. They believe that he's Christian already, right? They believe God is good. But what the problem is then? Yeah.
Wasn't there something like what makes a person evil or something?
Why is evil exist? Yeah, because that is something we mentioned in Philosophy 102, those of you who took 102 with me. What is the problem is God is supposedly all-powerful, right? God is all-knowing. And God is good, perfectly good. Why is it a problem to have these three qualities at the same time? Well, if evil exists, The question becomes, how come God allows it? If we remove any one of these qualities, no problem. For example, if God is not all-powerful, that's what Manichaeans thought, right? God is all-knowing, He's good, but He's not all-powerful. Sometimes this different God is doing evil things, and this God can't do anything about it. He's trying His best, but He can't. If you remove knowing, you can also, well, no problem, you can say, He's all-powerful, He's good, but He doesn't know some things, right? He's busy with other stuff. Evil is happening, and He is busy doing something else. Once He finds out about evil, He will fix it. Also, you can remove the goodness. You can say, okay, He's all-powerful and knowing, He's just not very good. He Himself is kind of a Greek God. But if you have all three at the same time, you have a problem. Can you see that? Suppose a person murders a child, tortures and murders a child. Why is God not doing anything about that? He is all-powerful. He can do anything He wants. He can stop it at any time. He's all-knowing, so He is well aware of that happening, and He is good, so He is against this evil. Would He just be sitting there and like looking at it and going, okay. We have a problem here, and that is the problem He's trying to address. This is a very big problem for Christianity in general. So, how does Augustine answer it? Did you understand what he's trying to say? Yeah.
He told Augustine that inordinate desire is what drives evil.
Yeah, desire drive, that's what drives evil. I guess you didn't go far enough, because there's another problem. Yeah.
He distinguishes between two kinds of evil, so moral evil and natural evil.
Okay, yeah, moral evil and natural evil. It still doesn't kind of explain that. Why is evil happening? So why is evil happening? What's the next subject there?
The misuse of free will.
Free will. That's the answer. He gave us the free will to do whatever we want. We can choose good, but we can also choose evil. So the traditional answer based on this, the idea is like this. If God was constantly controlling us and making sure we do not do any evil, there would be absolutely no evil. But then, what would be the reward for us being good? We'd be like marionettes, right? God is just pulling us towards good Himself. Is there any reward for that? If you are tied up and forced to be good, there's no reward. We have freedom of the will. We can choose the good, and we can also choose the evil. And yeah, he says the only real evil now is moral evil. This is what we do. Things like if there is eruption of volcano and people got accidentally killed, this is not really evil. We may think it's obviously not good when you're dying, but that's not the same type of thing. It's more of a random event. The only true evil is when human beings willingly commit evil acts, like torturing and murdering the child. We don't have to do it, and it's our choice. So that is why the explanation, God does not interfere with that. Do you think he's successful? Do you think he actually convinced? Did he convince you?
It's done to him.
Okay. Well, if you continued reading, what does he start talking about towards the end? Did anybody make it to book 3? Well, I'll give you extra credit anyway. You did something. The book 3, there's another problem there. And that's the problem with God's knowing the future, right? So if God knows the future, and He already knows what you will do in the future, how does it square with the freedom of the will? So for example, you don't know what you're going to do after college, so you're free to do whatever you want. But God already knows exactly what you're going to do after college. Everything until you're dead. So are you really free? How can you combine that? How is it possible for God to know it and yet you being able to choose either way you want? Because if you can choose something different, if you truly can choose something different, He can't possibly know it ahead of time. And if He knows everything, it seems like you're just like a marionette again. You're just playing this role which God already has for you. So that is another problem. Let's see how St. Augustine tries to answer that. So this is the problem of evil. Since God created the world, everything that exists is good. While some things may seem evil, they are instrumental ways of achieving good. That would be one way. So first explanation. It doesn't explain everything, but it basically says that some things like vaccination, for example, may seem evil because it's not fun, right? Who enjoys it? Anybody here goes like, oh yeah, vaccination, I'm going to get it. But why do you do it? Because it serves the purpose for something better. And sometimes we can see it. Something happens in your life, you're thinking, oh man, that is so bad. And then later on, a few years later, you understand that actually was a good experience for you, for whatever reason. Right? So that's one thing. Then evil is not an independent reality, but a type of privation, a lack of something. Everything that is not God will necessarily have some imperfection. So that's another way to look at some of these things. Evil is not a real entity. It's just not enough good. And the less good you have, the more evil it is. And finally, human perversity. That is the only cause of real evil, and that is the human will. We willingly do certain things which are evil. We select to do them, and that is the only genuine evil. And for knowledge, again, yeah.
Human perversity goes to like just perversion, right? Like of the mind.
Well, he actually mentioned stuff there, like murder, traditional sin. That perversity in the sense of traditional sin. Murder, adultery, they talk about adultery quite a bit, and so on. That sort of thing. So not every perversity, I don't know, like pornographic pictures, whether he would consider it to be evil or not. That's a little bit of a gray area. But there are certain things which are clearly delineated in the Bible as sin. You should not commit murder, you should not commit adultery, and whatever else. So that would be what he is talking about. So, but the tension with human freedom, whether it is successfully overcome or not, there are a lot of debate about it. Because on one hand, does it explain? Like, I think there is a discussion later, but let's talk about it now. Do you think it explains it? The fact that God actually gave us freedom of the will, and we can do evil things. Yeah.
I mean, I guess that would make sense with like the Adam and Eve, how like he had a choice to not bite the apple, what he did. So I feel like from there, it just kind of stemmed like we were born with the will to just.
But do you see any problems with this idea overall? So God created the world, right, and allowed us to be evil. But God is all good. So he wants us to select the good, but he doesn't do anything about it. And the things are happening when human beings select really terrible evil, right? Some people, the way they behave is absolutely atrocious, like the things you read about sometimes, right? God really does not do anything about that. In fact, there doesn't seem to be any correlation. That's the thing which many people notice. Like, there are people who are so evil, and they actually seem to have relatively normal life. Like, they don't get cancer or anything like that. And then there are people who are actually very good, and they get cancer, and they get other stuff like that. And it seems like if God is all powerful, shouldn't he at least sometimes interfere? At least, like, if somebody keeps on murdering and raping children one after another, like some maniacs, 10, 15, 20, shouldn't he at some point, like, give him a stroke or something, for God's sake? It seems like, yeah.
Just have a question. Did they ever say anything that they had proof that God was good?
The proof, well, they don't have proof. What would be a proof?
I don't know, but I was just wondering if, like, someone said, hey, God is good, and everyone believed that God is good.
No, but you see, Greeks didn't believe God was good. Greeks thought gods were naughty. There's many of them, and they're naughty. But some of the Greeks, remember, including Plato, actually kind of drifted away from this idea, and through reason thought that there should be one source of goodness, which is God. Except Greek God is not exactly like Christian God, because for one thing, Greeks never said that he was all powerful and he created the world. It's just like a symbol of goodness above the world, which we can aspire to. That's the way Plato looked at it. He didn't think that symbol will interfere when you're doing evil things. Christian God is not like that. Christian God is more like a father, right? He is actually loving us. He is actually ultimately good, all-powerful, and all-knowing. So there's a big difference. For Greeks, evil is not a problem. For Christians, that becomes a problem. Because indeed, there seems to be something wrong about the idea that this all-powerful God would just let us do whatever we want, including the most atrocious things. It seems like, some sort of evil experiment of a sort. Think about it this way. Let's say you had children, right, and you want to give them some freedom. You love them, but you give them freedom. They play around. Wouldn't there be a point that they could start doing things and you'd be like, okay, that's enough? Like, let's say they start poking each other's eyes. Yeah, certain things, okay, freedom, great, you can do many things, but not everything. Surely if you love somebody, at some point you would go, okay, that's enough. At this point, you're just being abusive. And it seems like that's not the case with God. It seems like with God, it's like, whatever you guys want, keep on going. You want to kill each other? Be my guest. You want to rape each other? Be my guest. I will punish you later, but for now, I'm not going to do it. And that is the problem. Yeah.
So as you were mentioning earlier, with one of the philosophers' beliefs, they believe that there was a good and the evil power. Like there was the good, and then there's also the evil.
Yeah.
But that's just as the concept of Christianity. God does exist. God is powerful. He's omnipotent. He's all-knowing. He's good.
No,
But
not omnipotent. Omnipotent means all-powerful.
He's omnipotent.
No,
Sorry.
yeah.
God is omnipotent.
God is omnipotent in traditional Christianity.
Mhm.
What you just mentioned, the Manichaeans, they did not think God was omnipotent. They thought there were two gods.
Mhm.
And they're both somewhat powerful, but not all powerful. Omnipotent means all powerful.
Right. Sorry, I was mixing them up. But in traditional, yes, Christian belief, God's omnipotent, all powerful, knowing. But just as their beliefs, how there's a God and there's an evil, there's also an evil that exists in the world. And that's like just like they mentioned, there's also an evil that does exist. So yes, God will let his children live freely, which is the good of it. It's the fact that I don't control you. It's the fact that I won't force you to do anything. But the evil is like, if I can get in your ear, I can make you do what you think you can do. And it's not to say that God is not existing and trying to stop anything. It's just that evil does exist. And for the people who have the perversions in their mind, they keep feeding it, they keep adding fuel to the fire, and so that's what would cause people to do evil. Because just as we were kids, we had to learn not to hurt and hit people in school. Like we had to learn to keep our hands to ourselves. But if, for instance, the evil's in our ears, like just slap them.
Well,
Slap them.
yeah,
you don't have that. If you're not listening to the other existence, you might fall into the evil. You might fall to the devil.
Yeah, you're describing what Gnostics and Manichaeans believe.
Mm-hmm.
But the traditional Christianity disagreed with that. And St. Augustine was actually at the core of this disagreement. He did not actually agree with that. Yeah, that's the discussion. So St. Augustine said that no, there are no two gods. The God is all-powerful, and he does indeed give us complete freedom of the will to do whatever we want. There's no other gods which interfere with that. There's only one all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God, and us. And it's our job to reach out to this God and to be good. Now, there are several other problems related with this. So, the two central issues for Augustine, which the reading was about, the primacy of the will. He was writing in Latin, so he used the Latin term voluntas, the will. intellect follows the will. Will, with respect to God, everything in the universe is a result of his free and sovereign will. The universe is exactly the way God wanted it to be. With respect to us, on the other hand, everything human is to be explained on the basis of the will we have. The will is completely free. Every single time you decide to do evil, you are not forced to do evil. You decide it on your own, and you are fully responsible for it. Similarly, every time you do anything good, you are the one who is responsible for the good. So, the difference with this Manichaean idea, agnostic idea, there is no evil God. If you're doing something, you are the only one responsible. Don't blame the God. Don't blame the second God of some sort, the devil as we call it. And so love motivates all action, both human and divine. The will is moved in the direction of what we choose to love. If you love God, your actions will be good. If you, on the other hand, love the bodily things, bodily pleasures, and matter, which is, remember, evil, then your actions will be evil. And you are the one who decides which one to follow. And God does not interfere with it. My weight is my love. Wherever I'm carried, my love is carrying me. So, at the beginning of the reading, he talks about it in more detail that, like, yeah, I decide what to follow. My desires, I have desires, like a variety of different desires, and I'm free to follow them or not. Right? That includes all sorts of bodily desires, like sex, for example, right? Committing adultery. I don't have to commit adultery. Nobody's forced to commit adultery. Why do people do it? They love pleasure, which they get from that. And they know it's the wrong thing to do, but they do it nonetheless. So that would be, he's Platonic in that sense. He talks about eternal things and changing things. Eternal things is what you should love. God is eternal. But the bodily pleasures, are they eternal? Can you have eternal orgasm of some sort or something? No, it's changing things. They're here one moment, they're not here next moment. It's like chasing something which you can never catch. And so that would be the problem. Now, how does the freedom of the will and grace correspond? Yeah, that is where we talk about Adam and Eve. This is actually traditional, part of traditional Christian belief. And the belief goes like this. We already mentioned it. Adam and Eve committed the sin, right? And for their sin, we are all punished. All human race is punished for the sin of Adam and Eve. We all carry it on us. And that, according to this more traditional Christian explanation, which St. Augustine also was using, explains why some people are capable of loving God and some people are not so much. So basically, the way it works is like this. Our rational capacity is damaged by the original sin. We're all damaged. But some of us get a grace from God. And if you get a grace from God, you actually can then understand the good and become a good person. But the problem here is this. God doesn't give grace to everybody. He only gives grace to certain people. And God decides who are these people, and you cannot earn it. So basically, no matter how good you live, God doesn't have to give you grace. It's entirely up to Him. So it seems a little bit unfair, right? But the explanation goes like this. Well, imagine 10 people owe you money. Are you free to forgive the debt to one of them? Would that be unfair to the rest of them? Seems like not, right? You can randomly pick one person and say, okay, I forgive you the debt. And the others can't complain, they still owe you the money. So similarly here, we all sinned against God. The sin of Adam and Eve is still on us. Whether God forgives you or not is up to God. You can do it or not. You cannot demand it, you cannot expect it. Because if it is something you could earn, like being a nice person, follow all the rules, and then get it, that would no longer be God's will. That would be then something you deserve and you can demand it. But that's not how it works. So how do you reconcile now the total power of God and effects of sinful nature on the one hand with Augustine's claim that humans have free will on the other hand? That is the problem here. One more problem, which is also something they tried to use the Greek religion to explain, is the Holy Trinity. What is the Holy Trinity? There's God the Father, there is the Christ, right, and the Holy Spirit. How are they related? Is this three different gods? No, there's just one God. So how are they related?
It's the evolution of God.
Evolution of God? So God became...
So God
Christ?
existed, then God put himself onto earth in his son, Jesus. And then when he passed and became resurrected, he became the Holy Spirit.
So that is all God.
Yes.
So God died on a cross.
Yes, essentially.
No.
A portion of him.
That's a problem. That actually is not the traditional explanation. That is one of the heresies, which we are saying right now. If you think God died on the cross, God cannot die. And also you cannot crucify God. God is all powerful. What kind of God is it if you can crucify him?
Jesus died on the cross.
That's why we have a problem. We have to explain how is Jesus related to God. The traditional actually explanation was that they share the same substance, but it's not the same entity. And that is where Greek ideas come in. So they share the same substance, but this is three manifestations which are distinct from each other. God is God, Jesus is Jesus. Still divine substance, but different entity. And the Holy Spirit is the third one. If you start thinking about it as it is all the same God, you do have a problem, because God cannot die on a cross, God cannot be tortured. All-powerful God would never ever allow that, never mind that for God to actually become human being is already kind of weird. So, but that is where some of the heresies come in. The Pelagian heresy is one of those heresies where they were actually thinking of God as separate from Jesus. Jesus is a son of God, separate entity. And Holy Spirit is still the third entity. That is one of the heresies. Thinking of all of them as the same thing is a heresy. Thinking them as three separate things also a heresy. So they, like I said, they share substance. The term is, I believe, homoios, similar substance. So now about his epistemology, theory of knowledge. What did Augustine believe about how do we know things? Can we know things? Well, now we're talking about the truth as being God. God is the truth. So we can know God, but first you have to believe in God. If you believe in God, then you can find the truth. So knowledge by itself doesn't have much value. Knowledge has only value if it leads you to God. It's a very religious type of outlook. So religious purpose, to weed out false views and subvert the soul's journey to God, to guide us in the search of the truth. That is what knowledge does. First you believe, then knowledge will be gained as a result of that. Having truth as the key ingredient of a happy life. Clarified version of truth also brings us closer to God, the author of all truth. So truth comes from God. The more you know God, the more truth you will know. Because God is the source of all truth. Certain logical propositions we know to be true, such as either P or not P, all this Aristotelian stuff, the mathematics, so 3 times 3 equal to 9. This is absolute truths, and they are eternal, so they come from God. What senses, on the other hand tell us that doesn't come from God. So whether or not there is a table in this room, I know through my senses, that can change, that is not eternal, that is not originating from God. This is also a type of Platonic. You see, that's the way Plato looked at it, right? These eternal truths, they are eternal. Whatever you see around you changing, you cannot really know it. But for Augustine, it's already helpful to you too, because it can teach you a lesson and help you understand God. So it is not completely useless. Still, you will find God within yourself. If you look deeply enough within yourself and know yourself, you will find God right there. The quest for knowledge begins with the self. We can be certain about certain contents of our mind, presented to us in self-conscious inner experience. When we talk about Descartes, I think next week, Descartes actually almost exactly repeats that. Although he builds the entire modern philosophy on this. He was a little bit in denial in terms of he took it from St. Augustine, but it seems like St. Augustine had the same idea. And the idea is, I can be sure about at least one thing. And this one thing is, I exist. Can you be sure about that? Yeah. Like, maybe I'm not in this room, maybe none of you guys exist whatsoever. Maybe you're all mirage. But I certainly exist. That I can be sure. And each one of us can say the same thing. Like, you can be deceived about whatever. You cannot be deceived about yourself. You definitely exist. And then, how does the mind come to know the truth? You need divine illumination. Remember that Christians didn't believe in previous life the way Greeks did. Nonetheless, we can still find the truth within us because God kind of planted it in there. Right? It's not left over from previous life. There's no previous life. But it is still within our soul for us to find because God kind of planted it there. God put it in there. And so if you look carefully enough, you will find it with the help of divine illumination. So faith and reason, faith seeks, understanding finds. First you have to believe, then you can understand. The belief comes first. The belief is the most important thing. And again, because of grace, some people have it, some people don't. You cannot just force yourself into it. He also thinks that we can figure out the existence of God. Next week we will see many attempts to prove the existence of God. Many philosophers after Augustine tried to actually prove it using logic. They thought they were successful. We will see some of these examples so you can judge for yourself whether they are successful or not. But nonetheless, Augustine kind of brings the first attempt. He says the very order, changes and movements in the universe, the very beauty of the form is all that is visible, proclaimed, however silently, both that the world was created and also that its creator could be known other than God. So if you look at the world, how beautiful it is, how amazingly it is organized, right? All those planets circling, the different stars. He says that can't be without the creator. How can this stuff to be there randomly? That's impossible. So and you can also find God within yourself by understanding yourself. That's an interesting idea which Descartes will pick up and many modern philosophers also, as we will see. We don't know that much about the world around us, but we certainly know ourselves to a certain degree. And if you look deeply within yourself, you will find things which they think actually prove to you the existence of God better than whatever you can find elsewhere. So a few other differences with Plato. Remember that for Plato, the world was created by demiurge out of matter. Matter was already there. But Christians, of course, didn't believe that. They thought that God created the world out of nothing, ex nihilo. So there was nothing at all, whatsoever. And then God created the world. Creation was an act of divine freedom. He didn't have to create the world, but he created it nonetheless. Why? To share the goodness with his creatures. Give us a chance to be good or to be bad. He didn't have to do it, no necessity. The world is composed of form and matter. That's kind of this Aristotelian idea, form and matter. The world of particulars based on eternal forms that exists in God's mind. That would be Platonic idea, right? So the forms are in God's mind, but whatever is created is kind of copies of that. Biological species emerge from seminal forms. God planted rational seeds. Why did he have to say it? They were trying to explain the process of creation as the Bible describes it. Because the Bible says it took how many days? Remember? 7 days, right? God created the world in 7 days. So, did he already create it exactly the way it is today? Or how was it happening? What was he doing on these different days? So the idea is some things were just in seminal form. They were not fully formed yet. But God planted those seeds, and then they kind of grew into other stuff. And that's already implanted by God. It's like DNA, right? We all have this DNA, which basically tells our body how to grow from tiny little thing, which we are at the beginning, to a grown man or woman. And it actually determines whether you're a man or woman, right? Determines your hair color, your eye color. So that's the idea, even though he didn't know anything about DNA, but the idea is similar. So those seminal forms were there, and they already had the future world within them. And God created time. That's a very influential idea. So God is not in time. You cannot ask, for example, that attempts to solve one of the problems, right? So if you have the world appearing in year 0, and well, actually not 25 now, but several billion years at this point, the question then becomes, what did God do before that? Was he just sitting there and waiting, and then like, okay, now it's time to create the world? No. The answer is that God is not part of time. The God himself is outside of time. So he is kind of simultaneously at the beginning of time and already at the end of time. So he knows the entire story. He knows how it will end. If it will end. He knows if it will end. And simultaneously, like again, knows what will happen to all of us in the next 5 minutes, tomorrow, a year from now, and so on. That is a very influential idea because many philosophers later on picked it up and understood it in this way, and it does kind of help us to understand certain things. Now, few more things about City of God. Remember, that's another work which we didn't get any reading from, but it is interesting because he over there tries to build history, philosophy of history. Prior to him, nobody even thought about the way that history can tell us something about how we develop as a society. For Greeks, it was circular, just things keep on happening and happening and happening and repeating itself. But then, he is the first one who actually thought that history has purpose. And the way things happen in history tells us something about what is going on with the humankind overall. Why? What actually happened is Rome was sacked in 410 by the Goths, one of the barbaric tribes. And many people were shocked by this. They were like, how come? For them it was like September 11th, right? And September 11th happened. Americans were shocked. How is it possible? Who are these terrorists? Why did they do it? This is such a similar thing for them, even more maybe. The barbarians came to Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, and sacked it. They like raped women, they took some stuff, they left. At first they left, they will actually come back later and even control the whole thing. So they were trying to explain it. And many people who were not Christians were saying, that's because we abandoned our traditional beliefs in these multiple gods. These gods are no longer guarding us. Augustine is trying to explain it the other way. He's saying, no. We are not Christian enough. That's why we got punished. If you want not to be punished, you have to believe in God truly with all your heart. And many of us are not even Christian yet. So that's kind of his attempt to explain it. And he gives many details about those rituals they had. And, like if you watch the movie Gladiator, those gladiator fights and so on, he says, that is all very sinful. We are doing this stuff, God punished us.